Hello, I'm Julie Lerman. Welcome back to Entity Framework Core Fundamentals. This module will focus on how you can control how EF Core uses its Migrations API to create your database and update its schema as the model in your solution evolves, whether that's during initial development or subsequent versions of your software. We'll start with a high-level overview of what migrations can help you achieve and the basic workflow for using it. And I'll show you how to prepare your project and Visual Studio to run migrations commands. Then you'll learn how to create a migrations file, and I'll give you a tour of one so that you can understand how to read it. With a migration file in hand, you'll then learn about using migrations commands for creating a database directly or SQL scripts to use later, and I'll give you some guidance on when to choose between those two paths. And finally, we'll look at a completely different perspective of the migrations feature, which is its ability to reverse engineer an existing database into entity classes and a DB context class. So let's get started. If you've never used Entity Framework or EF Core migrations before, it's important to understand the basics of what this feature does and its workflow before interacting with the APIs. Here, I'll provide a quick overview. Entity Framework needs to be able to comprehend how to build queries that work with your database schema, how to reshape data that's returned from the database in order to create your objects from them, and also, as you modify the data, how to get that data into the database. In order to do that, it has a comprehension about how the data model you've defined through your DB context maps to the schema of the database. And it performs that logic at runtime by reading the DB context and using its own conventions combined with any additional custom mapping information that you've provided to it to infer the schema of the database. And with that information, it's able to figure out how to do those interactions, how to build queries, how to construct commands to push data to the database, and how to transform database results into your objects. That also means if you evolve your data model, and that could be because you've made changes to the structure of your classes, or you've added more information to the DB context, then Entity Framework's comprehension of the database schema will also change. But that's just what Entity Framework thinks is in the database. So it's important to make sure that what it thinks the database looks like is actually what the database looks like. With each change to the model, you can trigger the migrations feature to create a new migration file for you, which describes the changes, and the code in that file uses the migrations API syntax. Then you use a migration command, which will read that file and create the proper SQL script. And if you'd like, the migrations API can even execute that script for you right on the database. You'll learn about doing that with your development database versus a production database. And one last point, an important one that I want to make about migrations in EF Core, is that they're designed to work easily with source control across your team. And this is a big change that EF Core brought over earlier versions of Entity Framework. You'll see more about that as we move forward. In order to create and execute migrations, you will need to have the migrations tools available to your application. So that's what we'll do now. But also, because of some frequent points of confusion, I'm also going to provide a quick lesson on how the various migration APIs and tools work together. This way you can be prepared for using migrations when your projects aren't organized the same way they are in these demos. The action of creating a migration file from the DB context is performed at design time. And there are a number of other actions that migrations commands can perform. But because they're design time actions, we need tools to perform them. And the tools for Visual Studio are different than the tools you'd be using if you were working at the command line by way of the cross-platform .NET CLI. The quick path to get you going is just to tell you to go ahead and add the Microsoft Entity Framework Core Tools NuGet package to the console project in your solution. And that's really all you need to do in our particular scenario. But because there has historically been a lot of confusion around where these tools need to be, especially when people only learn the easy, happy path, and then things are different when they're building their own applications, I'm going to explain the tooling a little more deeply. But first, you may be wondering what this other information is for the package reference, this private assets and include assets tags. The short answer is that with the particular settings for these tags, it's telling .NET that the tools package is only needed by this specific project and doesn't need to flow to any of the projects that are dependent on this project. And more importantly, that this package is only needed at design time. So if you're using .NET tooling to publish your application, it won't include this package in the deployment. .NET provides PowerShell commands and CLI, or command line interface commands. An example of this is the command that creates a migration file from the data model that's described by the DB context. The PowerShell command that you execute in Visual Studio's Package Manager console is add-migration, whereas the command line counterpart, which is an extension of the .NET CLI, is .NET EF migrations add. The two sets of commands both lead to the same logic that performs the requested actions. And that logic then interacts with the migrations APIs that are found within the relational package, the same APIs that also provide the syntax for the migration files. The PowerShell commands are in a NuGet package called Microsoft Entity Framework Core Tools, the one I just had you install to the console project. We'll be following this path, but it doesn't work the same with a command line. If you're going to work with a command line, you have to install the EF Core command line tools on your system using the .NET tool install command and then pointing to .NET EF. Whether you're using PowerShell in Visual Studio or the command line commands, you'll also need the Microsoft Entity Framework Core design package in your project as well. Because the PowerShell tools package that you just installed to the console project depends on this design package, you don't need to reference or install that explicitly. However, if you're working at the CLI and you've got the tools installed in your system, but you're not using the NuGet package, then you need to explicitly install the design package. So in normal scenarios, you should only need to install the tools package to your project when you're in Visual Studio. And you only need to install the design package when you're working from the CLI. We have 3 projects in our solution. Why did I have you install the tools into the console project? Since the tools are being delivered through a NuGet package, not a Visual Studio extension, they don't have their own executable engine. So even though you'll use the commands at design time, they're designed to take advantage of the execution provided by the console project, even though you're not executing the console project. But it really works. There is another way to apply design time migrations, but it's a little advanced when you're just learning Entity Framework Core. So if you do want to see it, I have used it in my EF Core and Domain-Driven Design course. So for now, as I said, really all you need to do is install that tools package into the console project. But when you get into scenarios that aren't as straightforward as this particular solution, this knowledge is going to be really helpful. And now we can move on with a demo. Now that you've got the tools installed, we need to turn our attention to Visual Studio's Package Manager console, which is going to be responsible for running the commands. And this requires a particular setup. First, it's really important to make sure that the console project is the startup project in your solution. That's because the console project is the one that has the executable capabilities, which is why we put the tools and design packages in there. This step also trips up a lot of people because they think, well, this is all about Entity Framework, and Entity Framework is in the Publisher Data project, so I should make that the startup project. But the data project is not an executable, so you need to make the executable the startup project. Now, it is possible to get around this by using an extra parameter in the migrations commands. But since we're in Visual Studio, and it's so easy to set a startup project, and then you don't have to add this parameter to every single one of your migrations commands, that's definitely my preference. Next, we have to make a tweak in the Package Manager console, which is there for executing PowerShell commands. If the Package Manager console isn't available on one of your toolbars, you can get to it from the Tools menu and then go down to NuGet Package Manager, and there you'll find Package Manager console. A lot of developers just refer to this as the PMC, so I'll mostly use that term going forward. While the tools are in the console project, our DB context and all of the EF core logic is in the publisher data project. The PMC needs to be focused on that project, the publisher data project. At the top of the PMC window, there's a way to select the default project that the PMC should be focused on. So use that to make sure the default project for the PMC is the publisher data project. Okay, so let's do a quick review. The tools package is installed in the console project. The console project is the startup project for the solution, and the PMC default project is the publisher data project where EF Core is installed and the DB context is defined. If you have that all set up correctly, you should now finally be able to use the PowerShell migrations commands. There's a nice quick test to make sure that you've got it all set up correctly using the PowerShell command get-help entity framework. You can also say entity framework core. Either way, this will give you a quick rundown of the PowerShell commands that the EF Core Tools package is providing. Before we look at the commands, I'm going to scroll up so you can see the EF Magic Unicorn that was embedded right into the commands help documentation. And if you're not familiar with the EF Magic Unicorn, look for a link at the end of this module to a blog post, a very old one by now, by Scott Hanselman, where he first used that moniker. There are 11 migrations commands here. Some of them have existed even back in the EF6 days before EF Core, so they may be familiar to you even if you're new to EF Core. Now we can finally add our first migration, and we'll be doing that using the command add-migration. Add migration will look at the DB context and determine the data model. Using that knowledge, it'll create a new migration file with the information needed to create or migrate the database to match the model. Let's use get-help again so we can learn more about add migration. This little bit of documentation shows you the syntax of the add migration command with all of the possible parameters you could use, such as specifying the output directory. In fact, do you see this startup project parameter? That's the one that's the workaround if you don't have the startup project specified in Visual Studio. You can just specify it right in the command. Notice that at the bottom of this help, there's a remarks section, and that tells you how to get even more detailed information about the add migration command. Although add migration does have a number of parameters, I'm only going to use the required parameter, which is the name of the file you want to create. And the name is just a plain string. It doesn't need quotes. You could put dashes or periods in the name, or even spaces if you surrounded it by quotes. But the class that gets created in the migration file will strip all of that out, and that could lead to confusion as you're creating new migrations. So it's better just to keep it simple and use a name with no special characters. So I'll use the name initial since it's my very first migration. So add-migration initial. That's it. As it was creating the migration, EF Core saw that I had a decimal property, base price, in book, and that it's going to use its default precision and scale for the database column. And since this simple code doesn't have any constraints yet, it's possible that I might enter a base price that will get truncated when it gets put into the database. It's really good to read those messages. We're not going to do anything about it right now, but you will see later on in this course, when we look more at custom mappings, how to fix that particular problem.